everyone, I am Kevin Liu. Some people might know me as Dr. Kevin Liu, but whatever. I am currently a senior lecturer at the University of Essex in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies.
Woohoo. And Kevin was my teacher last year, one of the greatest teachers I've ever had, by the way. So today we are going to be talking about how Jung was racist, which this was something that really caught me off guard last year. I didn't realize, I had never read anything about that. And so I think it's important for people to know about the truth of who Jung was and his character. So the first question I have for you is, can you tell me some concrete examples of Jung's racism?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Before we start, a shout out to you as well. You're such a great student. You're doing so well. I'm so pleased for you. And thank you for having me today, Anastasia. I'm really pleased to be here. For me, I want to give a shout out first and foremost to some of the people who've done this work. So a lot of what I'm saying today isn't kind of my original research, just to kind of make that clear. So people like Farhad Dalal wrote a really important paper called Jung a Racist, which is seminal. It still hasn't been matched in many ways, of just kind of pointing out the difficulties in Jung's thinking. And also Michael Vinoy Adams, I believe he was in New York. I'm not sure if that's the case now, but he wrote a really important book called The Multicultural Imagination, which is a great book. And there have been books since that time and articles since that time, but I think, Vinoy Adams's book really stands as kind of a plant a flag type book, if you know what I mean. So just to go over the three main points that Dalal made regarding Jung's writings on blacks, on primitives. So you see that slippery slope already where he's equating blacks with primitives. But there's three main points. So the modern black individual equals the prehistoric human. So in many ways, we're already moving towards this narrative of the primitive and the less developed. The black individual consciousness is equated to the white unconscious. And the third point, the black adult is equated with the white child in terms of its developmental trajectory. So let's kind of go through this a little bit. I mean, first and foremost, what strikes me when I'm reading Jung's writings on blacks and Africans is that he emphasizes the emotionality of blacks as an entire race, this kind of larger generalization, which we know is very, very problematic. But if we think of that emotionality, we think about not being able to control it. It's tied to violence, it's tied to impulses, the instincts, the id, etc., etc. And if you may recall then, when we're in the realm of emotionality, Anastasia, where are we then when we're speaking about Jung, where we're overcome by our emotions in a particular moment? We're in the realm of the complexes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You listened in class. That's awesome. We're in the realm of the complexes. Now, it's very important to state that for Jung, the complexes aren't entirely negative, but on the whole, and if we're reading this contextually, there is this negative connotation that we're looking at potentially possession by a complex, being overtaken by a complex. And what we're seeing then is that Jung is pretty much saying that there's no reflection within black individuals. If they're ruled or governed by emotionality, by these, immediate gratifications of impulses, etc., then we're not moving towards the light of consciousness. And as we both know, although many people would emphasize Jung's take or work on the unconscious, the collective unconscious, really we can't minimize the extent to which he emphasized ego consciousness, because it's ego consciousness that is absolutely crucial to individuation. So you could have all this potential lying in the unconscious, but without the light of ego consciousness, without that strong enough ego, you can't bring those materials back from the unconscious and to integrate it as a part of your everyday life. Now, what we see then is Jung equates consciousness and ego strength to white Europeans. Right? So we have this dichotomy already that you have, black, primitivity, the unconscious, white. the light of the light of consciousness. So if a white person is emotional, then that's pathological. It's against that person's nature. But for a black person, it's natural, right? So it's their natural state of being rather than being something outside of the norm. Now, another main theme you'll find in Jung's writing about black individuals is there's a kind of racial hierarchy that becomes very clear. So we've already talked about how he equates blacks with primitives and then with the unconscious. And then on the other side of it, you have the Europeans and consciousness. And hence you're already having this kind of narrative of white Europeans being more developed. But then he starts making some really, really problematic statements where he says things like white Europeans are perhaps ahead by a whole historical layer. And he says this in CW18, and I think in CW10 as well, he gives an actual number of how many years ahead white Europeans are in comparison to blacks. So it's very, very problematic. Now, if we're kind of moving on this trajectory and this line of reasoning, there's a developmental delay. He's implying a developmental delay. So if we're looking at this idea of the evolution of consciousness or the evolution of the races, blacks are literally at the stage of childhood. They're at this level of infancy. So think back to what we were talking about earlier, you know, being emotional, we can't regulate ourselves, we're prone to crying, to outbursts, to tantrums, we can't control our urges. I want that cake now, I want that candy now. I mean, I'm speaking about my kids. But you see the point, the connotation, the connection is that blacks are in the realm of childhood and not the realm of, let's say, the superego. So if you want to put it in terms of Freud, what we have is all id on one side and no superego. And that is highly, highly problematic. Now, I want to point out too that Jung's not alone. You know, we're talking about Jung because for me, there's still a connection to Jung. This is how I've accessed depth psychology and my career. So, you know, I have a lot to reflect on, put it that way. But you know, Freud's not innocent either, because in Totem and Taboo, he basically equates primitives with neurotics. So this is something that's not just specific to Jung, but something that is in the social and cultural milieu at the time. Now, there's a lot more we can say about this, but, you know, there's other things that I know that we want to get to and discuss. But, you know, Jung also talks about psychic infection. So this idea that if you spend too much time around blacks, you know, whites are going to start adopting black qualities and characteristics, which, again, you know, is a very kind of problematic psychological narrative and spin to take on this type of relationship, and doesn't speak to what I think is a really important movement towards an anti-racist stance.
I remember like hearing some of these things and just thinking like, what the hell? And like how many times he would use primitives to explain different like psychological phenomena and how problematic that was.
Yeah, absolutely. It really kind of puts your own commitment to Jung on the line, doesn't it? It really starts making you question yourself. And you know, many people have encountered this when they find the more problematic aspects of Jung, when they delve a little deeper. And I certainly, you know, when I delved into this, learned a bit more. And then I wrote that paper on racial hybridity, which I'll pass on to you. I'll kind of refer to it throughout if people want to hit it up as well. The more you dig into it, the more you move away from that initial feeling of commitment, of being understood and recognized and mirrored in Jung. So I know, you know, when I first started reading Jung, it was this eureka moment where it's like, oh my goodness, like everything I've ever felt, everything I've ever gone through, all the pains, aches, etc. It seems this man is mirroring me. He's explaining me. And there's always going to be that initial numinosity, that identification, and that connection in the first instance. But I think as you learn more and more, and as we move, you know, along our kind of academic path and trying to study Jung from an academic perspective, we're going to see and put Jung in the larger context. And that's where we begin to destabilize our commitment to Jung, but destabilizing in a good way, destabilizing in the hopes that we can rebuild a commitment to Jung that is not based on this very kind of unconscious fantasy identification, but something more robust and stronger based on critical understanding. And that's where the difficulty lies.
Absolutely. And I also had that experience too, because I kind of saw Jung as somewhat of a guru, and like, how did he have all these like amazing like spiritual realizations, and again like these things that really resonated with my psychological experience. And that was something that I really liked about the courses, that like immediately we were taught, you know, about like who he was as a person, so that we weren't lifting him up to this not almost like non-human, you know, status. So why do you think most people have no idea about his racism?
I think, again, if we're going back, you know, going back to what I said earlier, it's the fact that at an individual level and even at a therapeutic level, and I'm thinking more therapy thinking rather than therapy itself. You know, I think therapy is an important part of people's journeys if that's for them and that's their route to take. But obviously people can read Jung and there is therapeutic value in his work because we can apply it to our own lives. And I think when people are hurting, they're focusing more on their individual experience rather than kind of taking a step back and looking at the larger context in which the thinking is formed, right? So initially what we're working on is ourselves, but working on ourselves slowly but surely needs to move towards the betterment of all, right? So if we kind of see this in sequence, and Andrew Samuels talks about this, you know, we go into therapy, we work on ourselves in the first instance, right? And hopefully after a time, there's a point where we feel better about things. Then we move out into the world. And then what we see and what we realize is that our plight is not just our plight. Many people are feeling a certain way. You know, people are feeling down, and that's a completely different topic in our very neoliberal society of why this is actually happening. But you then begin to see that you're one amongst many. And the next stage of that individuation then is, hold on a second, I've worked on myself, I've benefited from therapy, now I need to help society at large because people are hurting right now. How do I do that? And what that leads to is, for some, political action, political activism, but certainly a greater awareness of the connection between the individual and the whole, right? That what has helped me heal is giving me the foundation to go out there and help other people at that larger level. So you see then, it's not just about me, it's about the larger society. So when we first engage with Jung, yes, there is this kind of initial energy and pull. But when we, you know, as we mature, as we kind of move out the love at first sight phase, if you know what I mean, you know, we're moving more and more of putting Jung in relief, in relief of the social and the collective.
Can we discuss that Jung was not only racist, but also anti-Semitic? Can you share some examples of his anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really complex. So I want to start off by saying that, and you know, even with his really problematic statements on race and racism, racial hierarchies, there's a complexity in Jung that we have to take note of. And even thinking about his notion of the bipolarity of the archetype, that for everything we find that's negative and controversial, there is potentially light at the end of the tunnel. So I want us to kind of hold that in mind as we go through some of these examples as well. I think perhaps more so than his discussion of race and racial hierarchies, his anti-Semitic streak is a bit more complex. I certainly admit that there are some pretty bad statements, but equally, you could see the flip side of the coin and the positive things he did for his Jewish colleagues during a very tumultuous, period where he tried to salvage something for them. This leadership position of the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy in 1933, 1933, not 1993. So he takes up the presidency, and then this journal is tied to it. Now, the journal itself, the Blatt for Psychotherapy, its aim was stated to distinguish between the difference between national psychologies, right? So instantly we're getting this kind of psychology of difference. That in itself is not perhaps that problematic. I mean, I think we can admit that there are differences between races, and an anti-racist stance would actually note those differences. I mean, to lean on the universal is to not respect the various histories that have come to form us, the various contexts and oppression that we've experienced. So looking at difference isn't necessarily the negative thing. Where we begin to get into slippery territory is when he puts the Aryan race over and above Jewish psychology. He puts the Germans above the Jews. Now, again, this is very complex because the reasons for doing this are overdetermined in the psychoanalytic sense. There's so many different ideas and reasons to take into account. So first, we have to look at the personal level and his relationship with Freud, and Freud being his senior, being his mentor for a time, and being a Jew. And as we know, after the split, Freud basically tries to write Jung out of the history of the psychoanalytic movement by minimizing his contribution to psychoanalysis, which really, is very damaging. Yeah, really damaging for him at the time. And then on top of it, as we know, Freud kind of creates his little gang, the secret committee, of his kind of closest psychoanalytic colleagues, and basically anyone who doesn't toe the psychoanalytic line are going to be attacked by this group. And Jung was attacked. His book on Symbols of Transformation got a really, really nasty review. So we have all this kind of personal animosity that's being mixed in with the larger narratives in society. So that's definitely something to take in mind. Now, one thing that's really problematic is when Jung begins to fight back against Freud and Adler as well, when he's trying to position and understand his psychology over and against psychoanalysis and individual psychology, he attacks both Freud and Adler for being akin to women. So he's basically tying together this narrative of Jews are like women. They're weaker, they're catty, they fire at your weaknesses, etc., etc. Now, this is problematic because this is in line with anti-Semitic rhetoric of the time. Right? So that correlation absolutely puts him in that anti-Semitic camp. The next problematic group, if you will, of statements is when he equates Jews to parasites. So he's saying that Jews lack roots in soil, right? They're not entrenched like the Germans are in the soil. And for Jung, being entrenched in the soil is a connection to nature. And a connection to nature, if we're looking at German Romanticism in general, is a connection to creativity. So he's basically saying there is no creativity amongst the Jews, right? There is basically this kind of action of just jumping onto the host and eating from the host, if you will. And again, this is conveyed in the propaganda of the time, in Nazi pamphlets, etc., etc. So what he's saying definitely puts him in the camp of holding anti-Semitic ideas. Now, what's also problematic is that initially in, let's say, around 1932, 1934, he still held a certain optimism about Hitler's rise and Hitler's position as the leader of Germany. I wouldn't go so far as to say a positive estimation, but there are certainly statements in there where he's giving Hitler the benefit of the doubt. So during this period, he's focusing on Hitler's charisma. He's focusing on the fact that for him, he's following this great man narrative of history, that when we're looking at the deeds and the growth of societies, etc., it falls to men, which is another issue. It falls to great leaders and great individuals. And we know that in history, the rise of history from below has completely demolished this kind of fantasy stance and way of telling history. But at that time, he's open to Hitler as a visionary leader. And if we refer back to this notion of the bipolarity of archetypes, yes, there could be some questionable things. So he's encroaching on some territory, etc. But he wants to give Hitler the benefit of the doubt. Because again, for every negative aspect, there could be something positive. So you could see Jung being, or someone as an individual who's holding true to his psychology and trying to hold the tension of the opposites. Another factor to consider is that Jung actually preferred an oligarchy, and he hated communism. I mean, he was really against communism. So, you know, with an oligarchy, you're looking at rule by the few. And in psychological terms, you're looking at the rule of the individuated. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what he would have preferred. But again, really against the rule of the many. And I think that really also fed into, I wouldn't say hope, but the kind of wait and see attitude that he had in terms of Hitler and seeing whether or not his rise as an individual, as a leader, would amount to some good. The reservations around Hitler don't really creep in until 1939 and beyond. So many people would say that, well, you didn't stand by us, you kind of missed the boat on it. And he openly admitted to, you know, after the war, to Rabbi Leo Beck that he screwed up, right? He absolutely messed up. Now, if we want to touch on the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy, and I think this is where the picture gets a little more complex, and we have to give Jung his due to a certain extent. So what happened? So he takes over the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy in 1933. Now, the group itself, there's a German wing or a German subgroup that begins to form within this organization. And there, at least for Jung, there's a potential danger that this little subgroup would then overtake and politicize the organization. So what he does is that he creates the International General Medical Society for Psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. And what happens here then is that, well, the German group then is just one group. He basically decentralizes power. The German group is one group amongst many other subgroups and nationalities, mm-hmm. right? Now, the very interesting loophole that he creates is that in order to belong to this new society, the International Society, you can gain membership by being a member of the group. So let's say the German group, the Swiss group, the Dutch group, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can become a member through an individual route. So you don't necessarily have to be tied to a group. Now you could see then that this would actually privilege Jewish colleagues, German Jews, who would have been ostracized from the German group. Mm-hmm. Right? So then there is an outlet for them to maintain their professional accreditation and affiliation with this larger umbrella group, the International General Medical Society for Psychotherapy. So you could argue that in this way, Jung was actually trying to help his Jewish colleagues, and to protect them in certain ways. Now, the difficulty as well is the journal controversy. So as we said, along with the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy came the journal, which is the Zentrablatt. Mm-hmm. Now, this is, I think, an oversight on Jung's part, and as we discussed throughout the course, Jung hated admin. He bloody hated it. He didn't want to touch it at all. When it was like down to him at the Bergozli, Emma did a lot of his work. Right, he couldn't be arsed to do the calculations for the test, so they got Ricklin in to help him. So we know this man absolutely hated his admin. And Jung actually left the running of the journal to the German editorial staff. Now then, it's no surprise that the German editorial staff was actually made up by members of the German group of the International Society. So that initial German subgroup that was forming within the General Medical Society, which then becomes just one group amongst many under the umbrella of the International General Medical Society for Psychotherapy. Mm. Now, the person leading on this subgroup was Matthias Göring. So he's a psychiatrist, but also the cousin of Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal. So we know that Hermann Göring was the second in command of the Nazi Party, founder of the Gestapo, right? So these two individuals are connected. So you see the path that we're heading down towards. Now, Matthias Göring, apparently, unbeknownst to Jung, inserts a very kind of political program and statement into one of the issues. I believe it's a December issue, and Jung had no knowledge about it. It creates a massive uproar, as you can imagine, and it implicates Jung. So there is that controversy involved. You know, did he know this was happening, or was it just really down to him not really keeping up with things? But ultimately, if you're the head of this, you know, you have to have oversight over it.
Why isn't it a viable response to say that he was a man of his time? Or do you think it is a viable response?
And well, other people, men and women of his time, saw the danger. So to say that, you know, you had to be some kind of super individuated person in order to fight the infection of the mass, well, that just doesn't fly, does it? Mm-hmm. Because people at the time saw it as well. So why couldn't Jung see it? So I think that's one part of it. But equally, if we wanted to go down that more psychological route to turn Jung's psychology on himself, if you will, in the analysis, someone who's championing individuation, recognition of the shadow, etc., to not see it for so long, that kind of strikes you as fairly odd, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. So I think we could go down that route. I mean, what I'm more interested now in is, you know, what do we do? What position do we start from? And I think Dalal asked a really important question at the end of his essay, where he's basically saying, how do we bloody salvage this, right? This ship is sinking, mate. You know, what the hell do we do about it? And the question is, you know, can we maintain ideas like individuation, the archetypes, etc., in light of the very blatant racist backdrop of the psychology itself? And that's the important question to ask. How do we square that with ourselves? Mm-hmm. And I think it really boils down to each individual and the post-Jungians. So people coming after Jung, people who have a deep respect for Jung's ideas, but also a critical distance from those ideas. And being that critical friend to challenge Jung, to challenge those ideas, to redevelop them in conversation with other disciplines, with other methodologies. And I think that really boils down to each individual person and, you know, how do you live with yourself? And for me specifically, yes, there's a lot to be concerned about in Jung. You know, when I started delving into this deeper, I really held the mirror up to myself and say, wow, do I really want to be doing this? You know, I'm Asian, you know, I'm Chinese. My kids are mixed race. Is this the legacy, you know, that I kind of want to lead? But equally, from a very personal level, as we said earlier, Jung did me a great deal of good. I mean, I could say a very dark period I went through, you know, in my late teens and 20s, Jung was pretty pivotal in kind of holding out that hand and pulling me out from the abyss, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So there is certainly that tension there, but it's the idea of, well, what do we do now? If my intention is to forward an anti-racist stance, how does Jung potentially contribute to it? Yes, the racist statements, they're in the backdrop. We can't deny them. We can't ignore them. They're facts, right? Anyone who goes and reads the stuff, it's a fact. So we can't turn a blind eye. It's more about the reparation and the reconciliation. Well, what do I do now with it? And yes, I acknowledge that this exists. I may in future teach Jung differently because of what I know now and everything that's happened as well. I mean, you know, I was talking about decolonizing the curriculum before all this exploded with Black Lives Matter, etc. But then again, other people have been saying this for ages before me, so I'm late to the show as well. But knowing that if this is my kind of political goal and aim, what in Jung, in terms of his method, in terms of certain ideas, will allow me to forward that anti-racist stance, right? So how do I now teach Jung differently as well? So yes, we can teach Jung, we can teach David Hume as well, yeah. But at the same time, we teach it from a different perspective. We also have to look at those racist ideas that are embedded within the larger movement of the ideas that we're looking at. Now, I don't have all the answers, but I certainly changing the way we teach analytical psychology is a big part of it. I'm sure that colleagues who are therapists will think about training, right? And how these certain ideas might be preventing individuals from signing up to want to train in a particular tradition.
Despite his shortcomings, how do you continue to study his work?
Yeah, with great difficulty. Not always great difficulty. I always have, ups and downs, and I think that's absolutely natural. I spoke earlier about reparation, and I'll send you my paper on racial hybridity, where I'm starting to bash out some of these ideas and looking specifically at some of the comments he made about Chinese people in general, but also about racial hybridity.
Like, I don't remember reading about what he said in terms of like what he said about Asian people.
So there was one particular quote I remember from the paper that was problematic, where he's speaking about Americans and how, for some odd reason they start eloping with Chinamen, and this, it then creates, if you will, these kind of very, how should we phrase this? These hybrids who are very interesting, but equally on the verge of potentially, psychological difficulty and mental illness and mental health. So there are some really problematic ideas. I'll shoot my paper over to you, and we'll find a way to get it out to people if they want to read up on that.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this with you today, and hopefully there'll be, a future opportunity where we can discuss things a bit more, maybe a different topic.
Yeah, absolutely.